2 Americans were killed and 2 others are safe in a U.S. hospital.
2 Americans are speaking out more than a month after they were kidnapped by a drug cartel in Mexico.
Mexican cartels are known for committing a plethora of offenses, and one of the crimes that seems to particularly plague the country of Mexico is kidnapping. Over the years, there have been several thousands of kidnapped victims in Mexico alone, and in many cases, the victims did not live to tell the tale. However, there have been those lucky few who were fortunate enough to escape their captors, be it by paid ransom, or just finding some clever way to run away. In this video, we'll tell you the story of 5 of these lucky survivors, and how they were able to escape the clutches of their captors. Luis, Freddy, Lala, Pomavilla. In 2010, the Mexican authorities made a shocking and horrifying discovery that would forever scar the nation's history. Deep within the confines of an abandoned ranch, the bodies of 72 migrants were unearthed, their lives extinguished in a ruthless act of violence. The victims were found stacked against one another, a grim testament to the brutality inflicted upon them by the notorious Los Zetas drug gang. Known for their paramilitary discipline and severely brutal tactics, Los Zetas sought to instill fear in the hearts and minds of both their rivals and the common folk. Among the tragic scenes of carnage, there was one solitary survivor who emerged from the blood-soaked nightmare, an 18-year-old named Luis Freddy Lala Pomavilla. Shot and left for dead, Freddy summoned the last vestiges of his strength and managed to escape the clutches of death. Crawling agonizingly towards a checkpoint, he desperately sought medical assistance for his grievous gunshot wound. Little did he know that his survival would eventually lead the authorities to the very ranch where his companions had met their untimely demise, setting the stage for a grueling confrontation. Recalling the harrowing events, Freddy revealed that he and his fellow migrants had embarked on a treacherous journey bound for the United States of America, seeking better lives and brighter futures. Tragically, their aspirations were violently interrupted when they fell victim to the clutches of Los Zetas. It was a common occurrence for drug gangs to abduct migrants, holding them hostage in hopes of extorting ransom money from their families. In this particular case, the migrants were presented with a dire ultimatum: pay a hefty sum as ransom or become unwilling pawns in the drug cartel's nefarious operations as couriers and hitmen. Faced with such bleak choices, most of them bravely refused, ultimately sealing their fates. The captives were callously blindfolded, ordered to lie down, and ruthlessly executed. The toll of this senseless act of violence was staggering, with 58 men and 14 women becoming victims of an indescribable horror. Amidst the chaos of the ensuing firefight between the gunmen and the authorities, a Marine and 3 of the assailants tragically lost their lives. One perpetrator was apprehended, while an unknown number of others managed to flee the scene in hastily departing vehicles. In the aftermath of the gun battle, the Marines made a chilling discovery as they scoured the ranch, stumbling upon the remains of the 72 innocent souls. Further inspection of the premises yielded a cache of 21 assault rifles, shotguns, along with a staggering 6,500 rounds of ammunition. Additionally, bulletproof vests and camouflage uniforms were found, providing further insight into the sinister nature of Los Zetas' operations. Regrettably, this grim discovery marked the 3rd instance that year in which Mexican authorities uncovered mass graves. In one disturbing incident, 55 bodies were found in an abandoned mine near Taxco, a picturesque colonial-era city south of Mexico City that had once been a beloved tourist destination. In another macabre episode, investigators unearthed 51 corpses during a 2-day excavation in a field near a trash dump outside the bustling metropolis of Monterrey. Many of the victims were believed to be rival traffickers, their lives extinguished as part of a deadly power struggle. In both instances, it was suspected that the bodies had been deposited at the sites over an extended period, a chilling testament to the enduring violence that plagued the region. Luis Freddy Lala Pomavilla, having miraculously survived what has now become the deadliest massacre in Mexico's drug war, found himself facing an uncertain future. Witnesses or survivors of such heinous crimes in Mexico are often subjected to relentless pursuit, becoming targets of further violence. Fully aware of the dangers he faced, Freddy's Ecuadorian citizenship prompted immediate action from his home country. Ecuador swiftly requested enhanced protection for Freddy as he embarked on his journey towards physical and emotional recovery. Under heavy guard, Freddy underwent a grueling rehabilitation process, all while his safety remained a paramount concern. In a display of incredible resilience, Freddy chose not to accept a humanitarian visa, instead opting to return to his native Ecuador. As Mexican diplomats handed him over to their Ecuadorian counterparts at a military hangar, hangar within Mexico City's international airport, Freddy bid farewell to a nation still reeling from the horrors it had witnessed. The gruesome events that transpired at the abandoned ranch served as a stark reminder of the urgent need for collective efforts to combat the drug-related violence that continues to plague Mexico and disrupt countless lives. The massacre, condemned by Mexico, the United States of America, and the international community at large, stands as a somber testament to the depths of human cruelty. It serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle faced by migrants seeking better lives and the devastating consequences of ruthless criminal organizations. While Freddy's survival offers a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness, it is a haunting tale that will forever be etched in the annals of Mexico's troubled history. Only time will tell if this tragedy will serve as a catalyst for change and inspire renewed determination to rid the nation of the scourge that is tearing it apart from within. Yolanda Alvarez Antunes. One would imagine that a kidnap would involve a victim, the perpetrators, and a ransom, as well as the person who pays the ransom. Hardly does anyone hear of the ransom payer falling victim to a kidnap while trying to pay said ransom. That was the situation Yolanda found herself in. While trying to pay her husband's ransom to free him, she fell into a trap of her own. She was assured by the kidnappers that her husband would be free if she complied, and any wife would have no choice but to do as the kidnappers said. At around 10:30 p.m., Yolanda and her brother-in-law drove their family truck to a mountain in the southern state of Guerrero. When they arrived, they were met by 2 pickup trucks occupied by armed men. In order to avoid digital tracking, these sorts of transactions are done in cash. To that end, Yolanda handed over a plastic bag full of money, but things didn't go as smoothly as she had imagined it would. Instead of securing her husband's freedom, she herself was taken captive. Who could have expected such a turn of events? Certainly not Yolanda. The real question, though, was why? Well, as it turned out, Yolanda's husband had escaped, according to the armed men, and they planned on holding her till they found him. They drove out of town and followed a mountain trail into the darkness. Only victims of a similar ordeal can understand what was going through Yolanda's mind at this point. She had only ever heard of kidnappings and armed men on the news, and to her, it was all a distant problem. But here she was, right in the middle of it, the victim of those kidnappings she used to hear about on TV. When they arrived at the camp, the kidnappers blindfolded Yolanda and her brother-in-law, gave them a blanket and a bunch of instructions. They were to lie on the ground, ask for permission if they wanted to go to the bathroom, and they were told not to so much as get up without consent. Otherwise, they'd get shot. Contrary to what the kidnappers told her, Yolanda believed that her husband didn't escape, but was in fact sent home. The thought that she'd alleviated some of his suffering was comforting to her. Her beloved husband, Beto, was abducted on January 10, 2013, by armed men who pulled him out of the small grocery store he owned on the highway in Ahuehuepan, a town of about 500 people with 1 public phone and no cell phone service. After a few hours, the first call came in, and his captors demanded a sum of 500,000 pesos, or nearly $40,000. In a week's time, Yolanda managed to gather a fraction of that amount, but the impatient kidnappers told her to bring what she had, threatening that they were tired of taking care of the old man. Yolanda now found herself in the midst of what her husband experienced. As her blindfold slipped, she saw that she was surrounded by 18 armed men, most of whom were in their 20s. They smoked marijuana and snorted what may have been hard drugs through a straw. As they did that, they showed each other explicit photos of women on their cell phones. Before long, they started quarreling. Yolanda had heard that drugs made people do crazy things, but she was witnessing it for the first time. The argument was so intense that Yolanda was scared, but her fear was two-sided. For one thing, she was scared that things might get out of hand. On the flip side, she was also worried that they might do things to her. She noted that the boys were younger than some of her children. Would they really touch her? Well, when drugs are involved, there's no telling what people are capable of. Yolanda had nothing else to rely on but her Christian faith. She had on her person a silver rosary, but she was worried they'd steal it from her, so she used her fingertips to pray instead. The men talked about gunfights, about having to watch out for the police, about the territory they controlled, the fact that they had to avoid certain areas because they belonged to rivals. According to them, they were from La Familia Michoacana, a drug cartel based in the neighboring state of Michoacan, a state known for widespread violence.
The state of Michoacan in Mexico is facing an unprecedented wave of violence. There have been more than 800 homicides there since January, making it Mexico's most violent state.
The U.S. Department of State has issued a Level 3 travel advisory for Michoacan, suggesting travelers reconsider travel due to crime. The kidnappers probed her to find out if she and her family had more money, to which she denied, stating that she had to take a loan to pay her husband's ransom and was now in an urgent need to find work. They were even kind enough to offer her a job, though morbid in nature. She was told she'd become one of them. She'd kill, cut off heads, torture. Yolanda was absolutely mortified. Eventually, they asked her who to call for ransom. They soon began complaining about a police operation in town and wondered what they'd do with their captives. They moved Yolanda twice, and then on Saturday morning drove her and her brother-in-law back to the highway, where an old Volkswagen Beetle approached. Yolanda's youngest son was the one driving, with her nephew beside him. They came with the money, 100,000 pesos, bargained down from the kidnappers' initial demand for 500,000. One of them, however, was rather frustrated at the incomplete amount that had been brought. He claimed they were 2,000 pesos short. "Who stays? You or the boys," he said. His companions were growing impatient and insisted to let them go, probably realizing that 2,000 pesos wasn't worth waiting around long enough to get caught. "Get out of here," the man said hesitantly. As soon as Yolanda got in the car, she asked for her husband, but her son told her that he wasn't back yet. Quite odd, considering what the kidnappers told her. Well, it would seem he never came back, and is now one of more than 25,000 of the disappeared in Mexico since 2007. The rest of us can hazard a guess as to what's become of these missing individuals. And for Yolanda, she woke up every morning hoping for a miracle, but her husband Beto was never there. Yolanda believes all this happened to her for a reason, and she continues to rely on her faith. An unidentified victim. In 2014, a noteworthy incident took place involving the arrest of 3 Mexican drug cartel members for the alleged kidnapping of an unidentified victim. The arrest was based on an affidavit that provided support for the charges brought against them. It was revealed that the victim and his father had encountered a predicament when they failed to receive payment for a substantial quantity of marijuana. This particular batch, weighing 200 pounds, had been delivered to a customer on behalf of a Mexican drug trafficking organization. The individuals involved in this criminal act were identified as Juan Manuel Fuentes Morales, a 26-year-old, Ruben Caja Rangel, 57 years old, and Luis Castro Villeda, 22 years old. They were apprehended and subsequently faced charges related to conspiracy to kidnap, abduct, carry away, and hold a person for ransom. It came to light that the victim and his father had been working for the drug traffickers, facilitating the transportation of illicit substances such as cocaine, marijuana, and money between South and North Carolina. During the investigation, the father provided a statement to the agents, disclosing that the victim had delivered approximately $200,000 worth of marijuana to a customer who had ultimately failed to fulfill their financial obligations. As per the father's account, the victim had fronted the marijuana to the customer with the expectation of receiving payment at a later date. Unfortunately, the customer never made the promised payment, resulting in a significant financial loss for the victim and his father. The drug cartel held both the father and the victim accountable for this substantial debt. Due to their inability to repay the debt incurred, the victim was compelled to sever ties with the drug trafficking organization, ceasing his involvement in their operations. On July 9th, 2014, a distressing incident unfolded when the victim embarked on a journey to pick up a friend and co-worker from a residence in the St. Matthews area. However, he never arrived at the intended destination. Filled with worry, his fiancée initiated a search and soon discovered his truck parked in a neighboring yard, its engine still running. A concerned neighbor recounted witnessing several cars in the driveway, but upon approaching to investigate, they observed a black vehicle speeding away. It was later that day when the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office received a report of the victim's disappearance. As hours passed since his vanishing, the fiancé received an unexpected call from an unidentified individual who identified themselves as a hostage taker. This alarming phone call originated from Mexico, and the person assured the fiancé that the victim was in their custody but unharmed. They instructed the fiancé to ensure the victim's father would answer the phone upon their callback, precisely 24 hours later. Over the course of several days, spanning from July 10th to July 15th, the hostage takers persistently contacted the fiancé's phone, making a total of 13 calls. During these distressing conversations, the victim's father engaged with the captors each time, navigating the intricate and unsettling circumstances. Unknown to the hostage takers, the FBI had obtained authorization from a federal judge to monitor and record their exchanges, gathering crucial information through wiretapping. The presence of the FBI in this intricate ordeal allowed them to gather valuable intelligence, enhancing their understanding of the situation and potentially leading them closer to the victim's location. The intricate dance between the captors, the victim's family, and law enforcement unfolded against a backdrop of tension and uncertainty as authorities worked tirelessly to ensure the victim's safe return. The dedicated agents diligently listened to and meticulously recorded each of the distressing phone calls made by the abductors. Throughout the negotiations, the kidnappers brazenly demanded various ransom amounts, ranging from $100,000 to a staggering $400,000. In addition to the financial demands, they insisted that the victim's father return the 200 pounds of marijuana that had been lost in the previous transaction. Aware of the grave risks involved, the victim's father, in an attempt to ascertain his son's well-being, implored the abductors to provide concrete evidence that his son was still alive. The recorded conversations unveiled a significant development. Juan Manuel Fuentes Morales, one of the abductors, made a journey to a secondary location, presumably to establish direct contact with the victim, aiming to furnish irrefutable proof of his continued existence. On July 14, 2014, armed with a search warrant, FBI agents conducted a thorough investigation at a residence located in Garand, North Carolina. During their search, they successfully located and apprehended Fuentes Morales. As anticipated, Fuentes Morales vehemently denied any knowledge of the kidnapping, fabricating a story that he had purchased 2 cell phones from Walmart on behalf of an unidentified individual. According to his account, the anonymous man had made several calls using the phones before handing them over to Fuentes Morales for safekeeping. Promptly, at approximately 5 a.m. the following day, agents executed another search warrant, this time at an address situated in South Roseboro, North Carolina. To their immense relief, they discovered the victim blindfolded and restrained in chains, held captive by Ruben Seja Rangel and Luis Castro Veleda, the very individuals responsible for his harrowing ordeal. When he was interviewed, the victim said he was kidnapped at gunpoint. He even stated that while he was held captive, he found a knife and tried to escape by cutting off his restraints, but was caught by Fuentes Morales, who hit him in the jaw and aimed a gun at his head for trying to escape. The FBI agent in charge of the case acknowledged how traumatic the experience must have been for the victim, who was told that he'd be killed if they didn't get the money, not to mention how psychologically traumatizing it would have been if they didn't actually have the money. The agents reassured the public that they didn't have to worry about their safety, as this was a targeted attack, but he also didn't downplay the fact that this was a very serious issue. The victim was treated and returned to his family. AG, aka Ghost. Imagine being a customs official and you see a man emerge from the trunk of a car, bound in duct tape, handcuffed, and running for dear life. I imagine you'd be shocked. That was what Mexican customs officials witnessed. The man they saw had been kidnapped and was being transferred over to the cartel that placed a bounty on his head. The man in question was identified in court records as AG, or by his nickname, Ghost. The person who was driving the car with the victim in the trunk was a 54-year-old woman identified as Roxanne Rocky Marie Carpenter, and she was planning to turn him over for 30 pounds of marijuana. This was the strange tale of a kidnapping, which was orchestrated by a group of drug users who were swept up in the current of the underground economy responsible for funneling illegal narcotics to and from the United States. Roxanne's attorneys argued that she and her cohorts, Felix Loki Begay, Fausto Zombie Velasquez, and Brian Edward Myers, were far from being criminal players. They were described as overwrought methamphetamine enthusiasts. Despite their claims, prosecutors determined that the 4 perpetrators had violently kidnapped AG for their own gain and negotiated with cartel members for his price. Roxanne and Velasquez were eventually found guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap, and Roxanne was sentenced to 14 years in prison for her role in the plot. This plot was the latest of Roxanne's run-ins with the law. Since 2002, she had stockpiled 3 felony and 7 misdemeanor convictions for theft and drug charges, and by 2017, Roxanne's house was being used as a stash location for marijuana. The trouble with AG began when he accused Velasquez for the misplacement of an unknown amount of marijuana. AG had admitted to authorities that he had been involved in both alien smuggling and trafficking of marijuana for a few years. He estimated that he had participated in these activities approximately 30 times prior to this incident. Roxanne's attorneys further accused AG of working with cartels by arranging the vehicular transportation of marijuana that is first backpacked across the border. Even after their arrest, AG still blamed Velasquez for the missing marijuana. So what were the events that led up to AG's violent abduction? Well, after the drugs went missing, the cartel went looking for it and showed up at Roxanne's house armed with AK-47S and asking for AG. seeing as he was the one responsible for the marijuana. They were aware of the fact that AG had been working with Zombie Velasquez, who happened to live with Roxanne. The cartel wanted either AG or the marijuana or both, and they suspected that Roxanne and her friends had been hiding one or both of them at her residence. Luckily for them, Velasquez, whose word carried considerable weight in a neighboring cartel, was able to convince the gunman that neither AG nor the marijuana which they sought were present. Roxanne and her friends had to do something about this. There was no escaping the cartels, as they had her under constant surveillance. They were going to kidnap Roxanne if they did not get their hands on AG. Roxanne's attorneys argued that she was desperate to save herself, but the prosecutors maintained that the plot to kidnap AG was fueled by greed. Based on interviews with federal agents, after Roxanne was taken into custody, she and her co-conspirators were looking to improve their living conditions. Roxanne told investigators that Loki had come to her and told her that they needed to get some money. Loki considered their living conditions to be ridiculous. Roxanne also stated that it was Loki who came to her and told her that the cartel was offering a lot of money for AG. Roxanne asked Velasquez to find out from the cartel if there was still a price on AG's head, as she didn't want to partake in the scheme unless there was money to be made. The original bounty for AG was $37,000, but in order to secure the money, they would have to produce AG and the missing drugs. Though the cartel initially offered to use a truck as payment, Roxanne declined because it would have been more difficult to convert the truck to cash to share amongst themselves. She wanted the payment in cold hard cash. Eventually, both parties agreed to 30 pounds of marijuana as payment for delivering AG. The price was set. All that remained was to nab AG, and Roxanne and her friends would have been golden. Roxanne brought along Brian Edward Myers, who was a friend to AG. He was to be the lure and was offered Roxanne's used car as payment for the job. Felix Begay was a US Army veteran with combat experience in Afghanistan. He was brought on as the muscle. The night before AG was to be kidnapped, Roxanne gave Myers and Begay handguns and a cattle prod, used for literally electrocuting cattle to force them to move. These were to be the tools for the operation. The next day, Myers picked up AG and Begay and drove to a remote location. While there, he took out the cattle prod and electrocuted AG in the neck. Myers and Begay struggled with AG, choking him with the seatbelt while punching and kicking him. Eventually, he was handcuffed, and they wrapped duct tape over his mouth, arms, and legs. At one point, Begay looped a dog leash across AG's mouth so that he could forcefully yank on the dog leash to get the victim to settle down and remain quiet. Basically, they treated AG like cattle. They locked him in the trunk, while Myers and Begay met Roxanne and Velasquez at a Safeway in Bisbee. After arranging the drop-off via phone call, all four of them drove to a friend's house where they smoked methamphetamine and had a good time. All the while, AG remained gagged and bound in the car trunk. Each of them had a role to play in this undertaking, and Roxanne's job was to drive the car with their victim into Mexico, where she was to meet up with two cartel members for the handoff. Roxanne got lost along the way, and the group had to reconvene at a bar. Roxanne then followed Velasquez's car to the Naco, Arizona port of entry. She eventually made it past the crossing, but miraculously, AG managed to flee from the trunk without Roxanne noticing that her captive had run off until she met with the cartel members about 600 meters from the crossing. They told Roxanne to go back to the US on foot and offered to get rid of the vehicle. Meanwhile, AG was safe with the Mexican custom officials. When Roxanne arrived at the border, she was promptly arrested. AG was incredibly lucky, as there was no telling what the cartel would have done to him had they got their hands on him. Cesar works at a stable where he takes care of cows and calves without getting a salary. He gets paid with milk, which he sells by going from house to house. He barely affords what to eat, making about $5 a day. Fate seems to have dealt Cesar with his fair share of misfortunes, much to Cesar's dissatisfaction. He was born in Progreso, Honduras, a village with streets without pavement, drainage, or even names. "I was born poor. We didn't even have enough to eat, and 50 years later I am still poor," he said, "and so I will surely die without having something of my own." Cesar attempted to cross the Mexican border into the United States in search of a better way of life. He planned to reunite with a brother who has lived in Jacksonville, Florida for 2 decades. The journey nearly cost Cesar his life. Early in the morning of September 20th, 2019, Cesar took a backpack with him and a change of clothes, said goodbye to his wife, and left to meet the smuggler, who was to help him cross the border and enter the United States. Cesar owed some money for the journey, and he used his car to pay off part of the money, which was about $2,300. He planned on paying the rest, which amounted to $5,500, if he managed to cross the border. According to Cesar, these smugglers usually charge about $6,000 to $8,000 to move someone past the border. Beginning their journey in Chiapas, Mexico, they embarked on a treacherous expedition by boarding the infamous train known as La Bestia, bound for the north. However, their group faced a setback in Puebla when some of their companions were apprehended by officials from the National Migration Institute. From that point forward, Cesar continued the arduous journey alone, navigating the unfamiliar terrain with determination. Pressing on, this lone traveler crossed the expanse of Nuevo León, pushing forward until reaching Reynosa, Tamaulipas. Unfortunately, Cesar's quest for a better life took a devastating turn when he fell victim to a heart-wrenching fate. He and 20 other migrants were kidnapped in Reynosa, an unfortunate circumstance that further amplified the dangers and risks faced by migrants seeking a new beginning. According to Cesar, at the bus terminal, there were some young people who told them that they should separate themselves in two groups. One group consisted of people that had a guide, and the other group consisted of people without a guide. Those who were alone were put in a tourist van and taken to a safe house in Reynosa. What was worse, they were just abducted by Los Zetas, arguably the most brutal cartel Mexico has ever known. Cesar knew the reputation of Los Zetas all too well and was convinced they were going to kill him. He described them as people without a heart or soul. His fears were further confirmed by the constantly threatening tone his abductors spoke with. Cesar said that they beat him up, which really isn't surprising considering the identities of his abductors. On the third day of this harrowing ordeal, Cesar's kidnappers moved him and 9 others out of Reynosa and across the river to McAllen. According to Cesar, the crossing was very easy. They put us on some very nice boats. They seemed luxurious, and there they crossed us, he said. Absolutely no one stopped us or told us anything. It seemed that everything was very well organized. With us were 5 more heavily armed men who were taking care of us. In McAllen, they were transferred to a nearby ranch where 50 other people were already being held. Such is the danger migrants face while attempting to cross the border in search of a better life. The armed men warned them of the dangers of running, as well as what was to happen if their relatives did not pay the $5,000 ransom. The abductors locked up the children to interrogate and threaten them in an effort to know which family members were waiting for them in the United States. They did this to confirm the information which their parents had given them. Crying women yelled at armed men, asking why they were taking their children. "If you want to know something, ask me," they would yell, Cesar said. Then the child would come out crying. In his innocence and fear, he told the criminals everything they wanted to know. If by any chance their information was false, the kidnappers would brutally beat up the migrants and rape the women. An utterly despicable act, to be sure. They were all threatened with having their fingers cut off if they failed to tell the truth. One fateful night, as the lights were turned off, Cesar managed to escape the nightmare by climbing through a bathroom window. Such an attempt must have taken a whole lot of courage, as no one dared to accompany him. Cesar was incredibly lucky. After falling from the window of the McAllen safe house, he ran non-stop for 20 minutes and eventually ran into the border patrol. He was detained and later transferred to a center where he remained for 2 months before he was deported by plane to Honduras. He returned to his native village in Progreso, still haunted by the memories of his harrowing ordeal. Defeated, Cesar returned to the very poverty he tried so hard to escape. He works in the same stable, and he hopes to raise enough money to attempt to cross the border again, not minding the risk of getting kidnapped or killed. Cesar is determined to go to the United States, so he can have something of his own and die with dignity. If you enjoyed this video, click on the card on your screen for more content like this. See you next time.